Hey there, students. Today's lecture is going to be on the Wars of Louis XIV. And as we look at the Wars of Louis XIV, we first have to consider the presence, for the first time in early modern Europe, of standing armies. The absolutists tended to build up these large standing armies. Louis built up a standing army of over 400,000 men, which was unprecedented. And what we have here is that Louis is really trying to turn France into a permanent war-making state, as opposed to before this, when largely monarchs would declare war and then raise an army. Now, of course, this is going to increase the amount of warfare in Europe, because if you've got an army this size, you're going to use it. You're going to be more likely to try to employ it in battle to try to achieve your personal and dynastic and national aims. And Louis's wars had a dramatic effect on the balance of power at the turn of the 18th century in Europe. Before this, the Habsburgs dominated Europe. If you look at this map from the age of the Reformation, you see Habsburgs in Austria, in Spain, in the Holy Roman Empire, in southern Italy, in the Netherlands. Here a Habsburg, there a Habsburg, everywhere a Habsburg. And Louis's wars are going to decrease the influence that the Habsburgs had on the balance of power in Europe. Now, when we look at Louis XIV's wars, there are four: the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the 9 Years' War, and the War of the Spanish Succession. And two of these wars I'm going to especially emphasize, these being the Dutch War and the War of the Spanish Succession. So his objectives: when Louis XIV went to war, he sought to do four things. He sought to conquer new territory. He wanted to achieve French dominance in Europe. He wanted to weaken rivals, and of course, he wanted personal glory. The fourth of these is the most controversial. Now, of course, Voltaire, the Enlightenment historian and writer, said he did not separate his own glory from the advantage of France. Every king who loves glory loves the public good. So while some people would fault Louis for his ambition and his vainglorious personal motives, Voltaire saw this as, well, Louis is advancing France through advancing himself, that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive aims to make Louis look great and to make France look great. But, again, that's a subject of controversy and discussion among historians. Now, the targets of Louis's wars were almost universally the Habsburgs and the Dutch, that he was looking at these two powers that he wanted France to replace. The first of Louis's wars was the War of Devolution, in which Louis gained territories in the Spanish Netherlands, today known as Belgium, and Franche-Comté. I think that I got that right, working on my French pronunciations, even though it is a written test, but I know people are watching in Europe, so hopefully I didn't slaughter that too much. And during this war, when Louis is fighting against the Dutch, he negotiates the secret Treaty of Dover with the English and Scottish monarch Charles II. And in this secret Treaty of Dover, they are going to double team the Dutch. Charles, who had money problems, was going to get money from Louis in return for his naval resources, that the British really had the only navy in Europe at the time that could rival the Dutch naval power. So Charles gets some money and Louis gets a navy to help him in this war. And then we get to the Franco-Dutch War. This is the war between Louis and the Dutch Republic, lasted from 1672 to 1678. Now, keep in mind that this is Louis XIV, the king of the largest, most powerful, unified state of France, versus the Dutch Republic, which was at the time really just a conglomeration, really a confederation of different provinces, which I've made a video about, which you're welcome to watch. But this is a very large unified state versus a very small fragmented confederation. And at first, this war didn't go very well for the Dutch at all. The first year of this war, 1672, in the Netherlands, was known as Rampjaar, which was the disaster year, the year of disaster. Thank you so much, Lisa, for helping me with my Dutch pronunciation. And as you can see here in this painting, which I had the privilege of seeing when I was in the Netherlands last summer, the Dutch had a very striking change of leadership. One of the people you see here is Johan de Witt, who had been the primary minister of the government. And he and his brother were brutally executed, and their remains were displayed upside down for everyone to see. Now, ironically, de Witt has a statue right there in Den Haag, near the Parliament building in the Netherlands, which is incredibly interesting to me. There are a couple of statues of people who were executed right there in the capital. And so part of this Dutch change in leadership was the appointment of William III, the Prince of Orange, as stadholder of Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland, and Overijssel. And the Dutch had just gone through a stadholderless period, and the stadholder was a very complex leadership position, kind of the rug that ties the room together, the glue that holds the whole thing together. This was a civil and military leader, and kind of a controversial position because there were people, especially in Holland, who didn't want this filled. But this emergency necessitated the reappointment of the stadholder. So William III is going to direct the war against Louis XIV, which is really a war for the very survival of the Dutch Republic. And knowing that he can't meet Louis on the battlefield, he can't match Louis man for man or army for army or anything like that, it's flood time. And the Dutch employ really what is a natural resource that the Netherlands, kind of like the New Orleans of Europe, a lot of it is below sea level. A lot of people in the Netherlands actually live on reclaimed land, land that was initially below sea level and underwater. And, you know, I read that Dutch engineers actually went to New Orleans in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And what you see happen here is the Dutch are going to flood their country intentionally in order to save it from Louis. The old Dutch waterline is let loose, and, you know, they are flooding farms, houses, possibly even cities. But the thing is that the alternative is Louis taking over the Dutch Republic. So drastic times call for drastic measures. And the Dutch also had naval superiority under the leadership of Admiral Michiel de Ruyter. Let me try that again. Michiel de Ruyter. Thanks again, Lisa. And this guy is a legend in the Dutch Republic. He looks a little like Peter the Great, which I think that is a great way to gauge how legendary somebody was in history, right? But Admiral de Ruyter is a hero that anybody in the Netherlands who's educated in history knows who this guy is. The rigging, I think. Oh wow, this is like Master and Commander. I'm like, woo, I'm on a ship. And the result of this war was that Louis did gain cities from the Spanish Netherlands, but he did not conquer the Dutch Republic. And the Dutch Republic began a period of decline. This marks the end of the Dutch Golden Age. That although the Dutch were able to survive, they were no longer able to thrive after this because of the massive debts that they had to take on in order to fight the most powerful monarch in Europe. But then there's a game changer. In the aftermath of the Franco-Dutch War, we have the Glorious Revolution of 1688 in England. And what happens here is that William III and Mary II are invited to rule in England, that King James II is run off the throne, and now we see that William III, yes, he should look familiar, the stadholder of the Dutch Republic, and now he is also the King of England. William III and Mary II were both grandchildren of Charles I, the English and Scottish monarch. So lots of inbreeding in these stories about the wars of Louis XIV. We'll get to more of that later. And so when this happens, what we see is an Anglo-Dutch alliance against Louis XIV. That Louis XIV can no longer count on the English Navy. He's got to then have the English Navy against him. And the British join this Grand Alliance. I'll use these interchangeably because it's during this time that, England and Scotland will actually join a few years after this. So sorry for those of you in the UK, I'm interchanging, but I'm interchanging by design because Britain does not really exist yet at this time. So Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and Savoy unite against Louis XIV, and Louis's not very happy about this, but he keeps fighting anyway. The 9 Years' War doesn't go so well for Louis. You can see that the French Navy is being burned here, and, Louis is having to basically fight against the combined forces of Europe. And this brings us to the climax of the whole thing, the War of the Spanish Succession, Louis's last, longest, and largest, most important war. The War of the Spanish Succession went from 1701 to 1714. It was the last, the longest, the largest of Louis XIV's wars, and pretty much settled things as far as this goes, and kind of puts into place the new balance of power that is going to predominate in the 18th century. So here is Europe in 1700, here is Europe in 1714. You don't see very big changes. The biggest change you see, of course, is the Act of Union that united England and Scotland as one country, not just two countries with the same monarch. And then you see a few small things happening here. Spain still has the same borders, but by that time it is under new leadership, which we will discuss in the course of this lecture. And this is the time where Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg ruler of Spain, died without an heir. Now, there were some issues here, that there were some reasons why Charles II of Spain died without an heir. And that is because Charles II of Spain was inbred. Now, I'm not just talking about like a little bit inbred or something like that, like, oops, I didn't realize you were my third cousin or second cousin or whatever, which is really not necessarily biologically toxic. Now, what is biologically toxic is when you are what Reddit calls inbred level 5. Okay, that just sounds awful, all right? Level 5 inbred. As we go through here, we see that we see Philip II married to his niece. We see first cousins. We see second cousins. Second cousins, again, socially unacceptable, but biologically maybe not so much of a problem. But then when it happens again, uncle, niece, second cousins, first cousins again, another uncle and a niece. And then we finally get to Charles II of Spain. And it's like, wow, like you just won some sort of negative inbred lottery. Charles was sterile, unlike his counterpart Charles II of England and Scotland, who was far from sterile. But when we look at Charles, we can see here the trademark Habsburg chin, Habsburg jaw. It is very, very pronounced. So all of these features become very pronounced because of this inbreeding, and at some point, Mother Nature has had enough, and Mother Nature turns off the tap. There will be no inbred level 6. All right, that's done. Well, where is it going to go from here? In Charles II's will, he willed the throne to Louis XIV's grandson. Now, for Louis XIV, that's great. For the rest of Europe, not so much. Why not? Because of the balance of power. Because if you put a Bourbon monarch in Spain, then what's going to happen when Louis XIV dies? Does Louis XIV leave his kingdom to the same monarchy? Do we see a combined monarchy of France and Spain? Do we see France and Spain combining in the same way that England and Scotland combined? And the rest of Europe is not really liking this and the implications for the balance of power. And so the Grand Alliance mobilizes again Britain, Austria, Prussia, the Dutch Republic, Portugal, and Savoy, and they all attack France and Spain. So, as Voltaire said, the king was surrounded by enemies on all sides. And this is really, like, if you want to think about the sheer awesomeness of Louis, that he really should have been defeated. He should have been defeated decisively, going against every major power of Europe, but that is not what happened. Although Louis and his armies faced defeats early on at the hands of the Duke of Marlborough, Louis was able to fight the Grand Alliance to a draw. So in spite of some early defeats, Louis is able to save France, and he's able to bring his enemies to the negotiating table to come up with a fair settlement at Utrecht in the Dutch Republic. So in 1714, the Treaty of Utrecht not only ends the War of the Spanish Succession, but it is the end of all of Louis XIV's wars. And there are three things that you really need to know about this treaty. Now, first of all, a Bourbon monarch will rule in Spain, but the French and the Spanish kings must renounce claims to the other throne. This is to prevent a unified Bourbon monarchy. Now, just a little trivia, today, the Bourbon monarchy is still reigning in Spain. Spain has a constitutional monarchy much like the UK. And so there still is a Bourbon monarch in Spain, although no longer in France. So, fine, Bourbons, you can have two crowns, but they're going to have to be two crowns. We don't want them to unite. The second provision is that France is restricted to the pre-war border. So Louis did not lose any territory, but he did not gain any territory either as a result of this war. Now, Louis has gotten what he wanted. He's got a Bourbon monarch on the Spanish throne. The Habsburgs no longer control Spain. He has influenced the balance of power. Then what do the British get? Well, the British get Gibraltar from Spain, which is still under British control as of 2016. You might have heard something about it when you were looking at the specifics of the Brexit vote, that 95% of people in Gibraltar voted against Brexit, but that is still a British overseas territory. Now, the British really were very forward-thinking, because Louis is concerned about these vain dynastic sort of things, who's going to be the king of this, who's going to be the king of that. The British are more concerned about naval supremacy. The British get Gibraltar, which is going to be a major naval base for them. It's going to control access to the Mediterranean Sea. This is around where the epic Battle of Trafalgar is fought during the Napoleonic Wars between the combined French and Spanish fleets and Admiral Lord Nelson's British fleet. So the British are really thinking forward. They're not thinking about petty dynastic concerns. They're thinking about power, and not just a European balance of power, but a global balance of power, because British naval superiority is going to mean a lot for the world in the centuries to come. So Britain would become the great maritime power of the 18th and 19th centuries, and I would say that part of this is because of the decline of the Dutch Republic, but the other part is because the British were very forward-thinking here, and they're thinking about naval supremacy. And so here is Europe in 1714. As I noted, the Act of Union has created one country of England and Scotland, and at that time Ireland. And Spain is governed by a Bourbon monarch, and then France is still governed by Louis's Bourbon dynasty and has made no change from when the war started. That is the War of the Spanish Succession. Now, in the next installment, I'm going to particularly discuss the historiography of Louis's wars, what did he accomplish, and just kind of go into some interpretive stuff. If you want to hang around for that, then go ahead and click through, and if not, I certainly appreciate you watching this segment. It's always a pleasure.